Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD. I am also someone who has to admit, right at the top here, I'm not a giant fan of the 19th century novel. I like to blame this on my high school. I went to an all-girls high school, absolutely loved it, Castalia School in Palo Alto. But for some unknown reason, they would make us read these 700-page, very dense novels for summer reading. One of those was David Copperfield, and honestly, it could not have been further from my reality or from my reading tastes. Some of you know from the lecture that I did on Dickens that once I realized he was paid by the word, I had this very practically moral stance on the fact that he was obviously just writing so verbosely because he wanted to make money. I will stand by the fact, though, that that was not something I could easily relate to. What happened that summer when I was supposed to be reading David Copperfield, I'm fairly certain I did not read David Copperfield, at least not in high school. What happened is David Copperfield drove me straight into the arms of Danielle Steele. I read so much Danielle Steele the summer that I was 14 that at one point I walked into our kitchen and I was narrating my entrance into the kitchen as if I were a heroine in a Danielle Steele book. And even at 14, I was like, uh-oh, I think I gotta take a break here. I maybe read 9 or 10 of her novels that summer. Which is actually a very good segue into a point that I want to make about Wuthering Heights. Today we are talking about Wuthering Heights. I probably should have said that earlier. In part, we're looking at Wuthering Heights because of the movie coming out. Emerald Fennel has made some, pretty bold choices in terms of casting, and we're going to get to the importance of that soon. But one thing that she said was that Jacob Elordi is exactly like the person who was on the cover of the novel when she discovered it at the age of 14 and absolutely fell in love with this book. I have some questions about who was putting, a Jacob Elordi-esque person on the cover of Wuthering Heights, given that in large part this is a book about ethnicity. But I'm also very impressed that while I was reading so much Danielle Steele, apparently Emerald Fennel was just really immersed in Brontë. So I mentioned that we are reading Wuthering Heights. Wow. Wuthering Heights is actually not a terrible misstep there. It really does feel like it might be called Wuthering Hearts. We are reading Wuthering Heights also because our youngest son, I'm so incredibly proud. He is in a play called The Bookstore Off-Broadway right now in New York City. If you are anywhere near New York City, you absolutely must come and see this show. And I'm not plugging it. Well, yes, obviously I am plugging it because my son is in it. But I will tell you, this is just an absolute dream of a play for anyone who reads. It makes it sound like an underdog story, some sort of You've Got Mail small bookstore against a behemoth, some sort of Barnes & Noble. That is not the story. In fact, it is a much richer, much more interesting story. So if you can see The Bookstore in New York City, it will honestly make you want to read all sorts of books that you otherwise might not. That is one of the reasons I came back to Wuthering Heights. And as I was reading through, I was thinking about this lecture that I was going to do with you all. And honestly, part of me was I just need to kind of take a step back and see why it is, frankly, that I don't absolutely love this novel. This is a novel that is fairly polarizing, but the people who love it absolutely love it. I myself am I'm just kind of in awe of it. I can really marvel at it. But I must admit from the top here, this is total blasphemy. It is not a novel that I love. But here's the agenda. This is all of the amazing things that I can say about this novel because, frankly, there is just an enormous amount to understand. So first, we're going to look at the historical context, what was happening in the middle of the 19th century, and also a little bit of geographical context of the Brontë sisters. We're then going to talk about the Gothic novel. Speaking of Jacob Elordi, maybe some of you watched Frankenstein recently. That is another Gothic novel that in some ways, gosh, it would be interesting. Anyone out there who wants to write a term paper, comparing Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein, you could really go to town. Those are also just two amazingly strong women who in the 19th century just would not compromise for their art and really just went for it. We're also, while we talk about the Gothic novel, we're going to talk about the fact that it is also a novel that is very much in the romantic vein, meaning Romanticism, the romantic movement, all of those romantic poets, not so much just a love story. Speaking of which, the next agenda item is to talk about it as a revenge story just as much as it is a love story. It's held up, people hold it up as this incredible, the archetypal love story. And when you dig into it a little bit, it is a very strange love story and really has a lot more to do with like sadistic cruelty and revenge and class and inheritance. I mean, there's some really passionate moments, but, not my definition of love. And then we're going to wrap up by talking about some of the kind of oddities of this book, some of the things that are like hard to parse a little bit. Things like the total lack of any kind of physical intimacy, at least in the scope of the novel, between Heathcliff and Cathy. We're going to talk about the narrator, certainly. It's a very interesting narrative stance. And we're going to talk about the idea of poetry and the way that Emily Brontë was a poet, but really, in order to describe this like incredible, unusual love between these two people, that poetry was sort of the default, and why it adds so much kind of passion and drama to this novel. For those of you on the YouTube, I paused and then I just came back and I was totally startled by my hair. My hairdryer broke. I have just like curly hair all of a sudden, so do with that what you will. So let's talk about the historical context here. Emily Brontë was born in 1818. She died in 1848. I think she was 29 or 30. That's pretty simple math. I think I pulled that off. She died of tuberculosis. She was one of 6 kids. She was on the younger side of those 6 kids. And they lived really far in the north in Yorkshire, which is a really important aspect of the novel. Her father was a curate, and so they lived, a curate? I think you say curate, not curate. Her father was a curate, like kind of like a parson. At least that's my agnostic impression of the whole thing. And they lived in something called a parsonage in Haworth, up in the north of England. Her mother died when she was 3 years old. And part of me was like, oh, it's good that she was so little when her mom died because she probably didn't remember much. But then I recalled the fact that my daughter was 3 years old when my grandmother died. And the two of them had this, like, they're very much alike and they had this very strong connection. And that death sent my daughter into like an absolute just obsession with death. It was not great. So once I remembered that, I was like, oh gosh, I mean, Emily Brontë would have been really, I think, very deeply psychologically affected by the fact that her mother died when young Emily was only 3. That death was followed soon thereafter by the death of 2 of her older sisters. And in some ways, I think we don't know a lot about her life, which I think is actually fine. But we absolutely do know that those deaths occurred, and I do not think we can discount the effect that they would have had. I listened to a podcast, it's called In Our Time by the BBC, and one of the people on it was talking about Wuthering Heights and saying that it's good that we don't know much about Emily and that Emily might like that she liked to write in obscurity and that she even used a pen name. And I was like, dude, what? Because Emily was very ambitious and she really wanted to be known and she wanted to be published. And I'm like, of course they had to use these androgynous names, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne. They used the names Kerr, Ellis, and Acton instead of their actual names. But I was like, they did that because it would have been easier, much like George Eliot, easier to publish if you have a male name. I was like, what? Like, this is a woman, I think, who really wanted literary stardom and really, in many ways, led her life in a way that really put her art first. So I would like to disagree with the gentleman who said that Emily would like to have lived in obscurity. Wuthering Heights was published in 1847. Which is crazy because it was just a year before she died of tuberculosis. So it's important to know, in the preface, very famously, in the preface of the second edition of Wuthering Heights, Charlotte talks about Emily as being like very kind of simple-minded and like this intuitive person who just had these kind of crazy ideas. That was partially because people were so astounded by some of like the cruelty and kind of the crazier aspects of the novel. But what's really important to remember is that this is a woman who was very well educated. She went to, a school. She had schooling. It was, in fact, became Lowood, which was the school in Jane Eyre. So she had like formal schooling. She also lived with a father who was a curate, but who was very literary. They had all of these important magazines that they would read. And those magazines had a lot of Gothic fiction in them. So she was surrounded in a house full of books. She was very, very well read and very educated. At that time, as you can imagine, there were not a lot of professional opportunities for these young women, and so they became governesses often. And when Emily went off to be a governess, she only lasted for like 3 months, and people talk about that as like she had so much homesickness and she needed to return to her home. But I also read a different article. If you're on the YouTube, I will put it up on the screen so you can see it, where the author of the article talked about how she, as a governess, in part was giving piano lessons and refused to give these piano lessons during the time when her writing, during the time when she was freshest to write. So she would only give these lessons in the afternoon, which her young charges, these young girls, did not like because it was cutting into their free time. So you have this sense of her, at least through this article that I read, as someone who was really taking her work seriously, and even when she was like in a professional setting, was putting her art first. This is also someone who is growing up at a time of a lot of turbulence. So there was this Manchester-Liverpool railway that was established in 1830. So what started happening was there was a lot of industrialization in the north, Liverpool being a very important port. Crucially, this is where Heathcliff comes from, which we will get to soon. But, Hindley and Cathy's father finds this foundling. We are going to get to that because that has to do with this idea of his ethnicity. But it's important that that happens in Liverpool because there were so many different people coming into that port. This is one of the places where you had a lot of enslaved peoples coming in. You have a lot of immigration into Liverpool. So this idea of Heathcliff as being darker skinned is it rests kind of crucially on the fact that Liverpool is there. So you have Liverpool connected to Manchester all of a sudden, and because of this industrialization, you have a rising middle class. That is threatening to the landed gentry, this upper class, these aristocratic people, because you have these capitalist forces, these capitalist people who are amassing wealth and threatening this landed class, the people who owned property. The Brontë family was not, in fact, landed aristocracy, but much is made of the fact that Emily Brontë is very like Tory, like she was, very kind of upper crusty in terms of a lot of her political views, which is so interesting because when people talk about her as feminist or talk about her as someone who is like raising consciousness in terms of like the injustice in terms of ethnicity and the idea of social stratification having to do with race, people are like holding her up as like this kind of progressive icon in some ways, when in fact her political leanings were relatively conservative. And in many ways, that sort of historical moment in which Emily Brontë lived had a lot to do with the actual writing of Wuthering Heights, because it is a book that's very concerned with the idea of, someone coming out of nowhere, Heathcliff, and sort of usurping the normal lines of inheritance. So this is a book that's very bound up in the ownership of land and who deserves what and what kind of, physical legacy people have. All of the sort of disruption that is happening there. It's not simply this father to son kind of evolution. In fact, you have real disruption. So we have that influence the idea of what is happening historically in the north of England at the time. But what is perhaps more important is the effect of the Gothic novel on Wuthering Heights. So Emily Brontë, she was born in 1818. The Gothic novel was really at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. So this came from, there's a book that was published in 1764, a gentleman named Walpole, and it was called The Castle of Otranto, a Gothic story. So this goes back to like medieval Gothic architecture, the Goths. And actually, architecture has a huge amount to do with the Gothic novel. We can just discuss that first. So one of the things that you will often see in a Gothic novel, think Dracula, think Frankenstein. Walter Scott wrote a lot of this kind of stuff. So lots of times you will have kind of ruined architecture. Sometimes it will be a castle. Sometimes it will be even like a religious place. You'll have it be an abbey or a monastery. And these are buildings that are crumbling and falling down. And you have ghosts and women like up on the top of the turrets. And, the wind is blowing them and there's, stormy skies. So that kind of architecture that's falling to pieces is indicative of the kind of like disturbance that all of the characters in Gothic novels are feeling. It has to do with decay and time and death. Speaking of ghosts, you have a lot of haunting in these books. There's a lot of question about like the sort of permeability of life and death. Bound up in that idea of, these hauntings has to do with fear. These are novels that really did, seek to strike fear in the heart of the reader. They were very interested in the supernatural, not only ghosts, but all kinds of different supernatural things. A lot of them rely on this kind of framing device. So we see it in Frankenstein, and we see it again here in Wuthering Heights. This framing device is often very important because what happens is you have an outsider coming into town, and you have some sort of narrator who is telling that outsider the story of what has happened. In the case of Nellie Dean, it's actually so interesting because we have Lockwood? God, is that his name? That is crazy that I can't remember that. I think that's right. We have Lockwood coming into town. He's the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange. That is so hard to say. I've said it like wrong a million times and I just nailed it. But so we have him coming into town, and he gets the story of what has happened at Wuthering Heights from Nellie Dean. That is important because Nellie Dean, if you will recall, grew up together with Hindley and Cathy, very much like kind of a part of the family. So she has known them from like in an intimate way from the very, very beginning. She is also someone who is, in many ways, it feels like she's telling the story very objectively, but she's not always so objective. I mean, you have to understand that if you're providing a narrator who is a character in the book, there are going to be limitations to what that person will know. For example, later in the novel, when we have these supernatural things happening, when, Heathcliff is a ghost or Heathcliff is like, exhuming Cathy's body and, potentially like having some sort of like crazy necrophiliac, urges. These are things that are rumors that are kind of unsubstantiated, and we're not in the mind of Heathcliff. We're not in the mind of any of these ghosts. We don't get a lot of a sense of like what Cathy is feeling because Nellie Dean is telling us all of these things from the outside. In some ways, too, Nellie Dean is like, there's quite a bit of a scholarship out there. Actually, I have not read a lot about this, about the fact that these narrators are kind of unreliable. And I agree. I don't know that she's so unreliable so much as just like she has her specific point of view. But she is someone who also has a lot of effect of the story. She ends up having a lot of knowledge throughout the story that she is not sharing with all of the different players. She hears things from Cathy that she doesn't tell to Heathcliff. She knows what's happening with Isabella, and she doesn't tell those things to Heathcliff. So in many ways, she is like kind of an active character, and I love her as a narrator. So we have a similar thing happening in Frankenstein, where someone is coming in from the outside and is reading and hearing about the story of Dr. Frankenstein. Oftentimes, we have these really complicated plots. So, Nellie Dean is telling the story of this, but it's like very convoluted. All sorts of different things are happening. And there's some like kind of soap opera-y things happening where, we have people hearing, eavesdropping and hearing kind of like half the story. That's actually a very important plot point. I should probably have mentioned at the beginning, we're not going to like do any spoiling of things. There's certain plot points that I think will come up, But if you haven't read Wuthering Heights for a long time, or if you're going to read it soon for the first time, I don't think I'm spoiling anything. We are not going to spend a lot of time talking about the novel as a romantic novel, but that is another piece of this that is very important. So the romantic, most of them were poets, actually. We had a lot of poetry, so think of Keats and Byron and, Shelley and Tennyson, all of these people who were very concerned with death. They were very concerned with time. They were concerned with the idea, certainly of love. There was a lot of emphasis on the sublime. And when I say sublime, I don't mean just like, our use of it today, which is like excellent or like, like really amazing. The true meaning of that word sublime is this idea of being in awe of something that is much larger than the human. So you can imagine Cathy and Heathcliff out on the moors and like, all of the crazy weather that would be happening. And this idea of humans as being very tiny and kind of inconsequential in the larger scope of things. Crucially, we also have from Romanticism the idea of the Byronic hero. So this comes from Byron, obviously, and the idea of it is that you have this it's very Heathcliff. You have this like dark and broody and like, potentially violent and cruel kind of character who over time, because of love, often becomes more heroic. I think it's kind of a weird thing with Heathcliff, just because this is a revenge story. Like this is so deeply seated, the whole entire novel, in the idea of him getting revenge, first against Hindley and then against Edgar, that really, I guess heroic in some ways, but honestly, this was part of my problem. Cathy seems like such a brat. They are so mean, the two of them, Heathcliff and Cathy. I just couldn't get over it. Cathy is dismissive and she's selfish and she's small, like small meaning petty. She's so rude to Nellie. Nellie's kind of sassy back to her, but like I this time through in particular, I was like, God, Cathy is such a bitch. And then you have Heathcliff, who it's very hard to get a grip on him because he is so broody and so like removed. Although his story I like a little better. He comes out of nowhere and is impoverished and then goes away and makes his fortune and comes back and gets revenge on everyone. That is, like, to me, that storyline makes a lot of sense. But certainly we have this idea of passion and individualism and this question about death, all of which are very like romantic characteristics. This characterization of Heathcliff is actually the perfect segue into the idea that this novel is much more about revenge than it is about love. Obviously, you could certainly put revenge under the idea of like passionate love affair. Like he's so in love with Cathy on some level that he needs to like seek revenge. But honestly, Cathy really did him dirty. Like Cathy, he can't seek revenge against Cathy because he loves her. But a lot of the work is really bound up in this idea of getting revenge against, as someone who was impoverished, it's really this idea of getting revenge on this landed gentry. So the idea of Heathcliff as like a kind of a heroic figure is a very good segue into this question of whether or not this novel, it has more to do with love or revenge. I'll argue that it is both of those things, but really for me, the most potent part about it is the revenge. So one of the aspects that's interesting about their love and kind of like their passion for each other is the fact that there is no sexual congress in this book. There is no like consummating of their love, at least nothing that we see. And some scholars would argue like that they're children, these are very young people. And it is true that they're young when we have Heathcliff arriving on the scene. And they're only like 11 and 12, Cathy and Heathcliff respectively, when they go to the Lintons, and she's attacked by the dog, which is so brutal. And she ends up staying there and then kind of gets in with their family and gets to know Edgar, and is, their marriage is put into motion. But she doesn't marry Edgar until she is 15. So presumably, Heathcliff is 15, 16. So like there are these scholars who say like, oh, they could never consummate their love because they're children. And there is a lot about their love affair as being this regression to childhood. In many ways, everything about their love has to do with the idea of returning to the state of innocence where they just like would dash about the moors together and like go out exploring. But we don't actually see them out on the moors very often. We don't know, it's Nellie Dean telling us the story, so she can't be like narrating what's happening out in the elements, like out in the nature of this like relatively harsh northern landscape. But if you look at the fact that she's 15 and he's 16-ish when she marries Edgar Linton, if you were wild and crazy and super passionate like the way that they say they are, actually it doesn't really matter. But the fact that there is no allusion to them as ever having been together is an interesting nuance in terms of like the romance and the passion that Emily Brontë is holding up. She's really promoting a kind of like spiritual union, which we are about to get to, more so than she's looking at some sort of physical love. And for me, that kind of also lends more to this idea of Heathcliff as, so we're not going to do like any real close reading here, but I'm going to read some sections, some chunks from pages 78 through 82 in my copy. This is right after Cathy has accepted Edgar Linton and tells Nellie that she's going to marry him. Right from the beginning, she has her reservations and her doubts. But partly focus here, as I'm reading, just on like, honestly, like how prickly and like unlikable Cathy is. You all know, if you've listened, I do not need a character to be likable in order to like really be compelling. But wow, was I just like impressed by the fact that Cathy was so difficult. And sure, we can read that as like a feminist icon, which I love. But I was just like, wow, yes, this book is rife with cruelty. And I liked like the kind of like sassiness and agency that Cathy has. But this time it really struck me as extreme. Okay, so on 78, this is just after Cathy she's like asking Nellie Dean if she did the right thing by accepting Edgar. "Really, Miss Catherine, how can I know?" I replied. "To be sure, considering the exhibition you performed in his presence this afternoon, I might say it would be wise to refuse him. Since he asked for you after that, he must either be hopelessly stupid or a venturesome fool." Which, I'm just going to interject here very quickly. Like, Nellie Dean is also just so bold. Like, she really tells it as it is. This is also just a good reminder of how extreme everything in this book is. Everything is extreme. Just that afternoon, they'd had like this whole blow up happen. Like nothing is happening by halves here, and nothing is calm. Okay, so then we have Cathy responding to Nellie Dean. "If you talk so, I won't tell you any more," she returned peevishly, rising to her feet. "I accepted him, Nellie. Be quick and say whether I was wrong." So then we go down a little bit. "Why do you love him, Miss Cathy?" "Nonsense, I do. That's sufficient." "By no means. You must say why." "Well, because he is handsome and pleasant to be with." "Bad," was my commentary. Which, again, is so funny. Nellie Dean is a total straight shooter. So Cathy goes on. "And because he is young and cheerful." "Bad still." "And because he loves me." "Indifferent?" coming there. And he will be rich, and I shall like to be the greatest woman of the neighborhood, and I shall be proud of having such a husband. Which honestly, I'm like, this is not, I mean, yeah, she has this kind of like spiritual union with Heathcliff, but I'm like, this is not, she's making a decision here that's very mercenary and really has to do with social standing and you know, lifestyle. She's not really like voting with her heart here. So she says basically that she wants to be rich, and Nellie comes back, worst of all, and now say how you love him. As everybody loves. You're silly, Nellie. Not at all. Answer. And this is a very famous passage right here. I love the ground under his feet and the air over his head and everything he touches and every word he says. I love all his looks and all his actions and him entirely and altogether. There now. Which is so funny. Like I love the air over him and the ground under him. Like, you know, very conspicuously, she is avoiding Edgar. Toward the end, of course, she says that she loves him more, but it's a very lukewarm situation. And importantly, in this section here, Linton is Edgar Linton. And listen for a little bit of the metaphor here. One of the things that is so interesting about this novel, Emily Brontë was a very successful, that's not true. She was not a very successful poet, but she was a very, you know, she wrote a lot of poetry and she published poetry. Poetry was really the lifeblood of all of the Romantics. So in a lot of ways, I think the young Brontë sisters wanted to be poets. And when that was not quite as successful as they liked, they kind of like downshifted and worked on the novel, which was kind of a lesser form of art. But one of the important roles that poetry plays throughout the entire novel is the idea of metaphor, and metaphor being any kind of comparison between two things. One of the things that metaphor and just poetry in general is doing in the novel is that Cathy and Heathcliff are both trying to express something that's inexpressible. They're talking about this like devotion that they have to each other and this like spiritual union, and it's very difficult to speak about those things, in a fulsome way, just by using the language that we have that I just said. And Cathy does in many different ways try to explain this feeling. At one point she says to Nellie, like, I'm trying to explain a feeling to you, or I'm trying to like help you feel a feeling. So there is this sense of like her not being able to access language. So there's lots of metaphor. Okay, so here she is talking about Heathcliff versus Linton, Edgar Linton. And importantly, Heathcliff is overhearing this section. And Cathy is speaking. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him, and that, not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire. And then we have a space break, and Nellie says this. Ere this speech ended, I became sensible of Heathcliff's presence. Having noticed slight movement, I turned my head and saw him rise from the bench and steal out noiselessly. He had listened till he heard Catherine say it would degrade her to marry him, and then he stayed to hear no farther. So this is like a very Gothic novel thing. We have him overhearing part of it, and then this happened in Buccaneers. Anyone who, this is like the lifeblood of a lot of romantic stuff. But he heard the first part of it and then got up and left and didn't hear the part about how like their souls are one. And I want to finish this idea of like, Wuthering Heights as this passionate love story by reading one last little section here. And here we're leaning even further into this idea of poetic, poetic images and the idea of figurative language, in this case metaphor and simile, as trying to express something that is very difficult to express. My love for Linton is like the foliage in the woods. Time will change it, I'm well aware, as winter changes the trees. My love for Heathcliff resembles the eternal rocks beneath, a source of little visible delight, but necessary. Nellie, I am Heathcliff. He's always, always in my mind, not as a pleasure, any more than I am always a pleasure to myself, but as my own being. So don't talk of our separation again. It is impracticable and then she's cut off. So this is crucial. There are a couple of different things I want to point out. One is that the idea of Linton as being a tree and her love for him as being inconstant, the names in this book are important. So Linton, which sounds very much like a linden tree, he is associated with this idea of being a tree, which I don't think I would have necessarily thought about that, the Linton connection, except for the fact that Heathcliff, I mean, we're on the moors, not so much the heaths here, but we have this idea of Heathcliff as being ground, like it's not a tree, it's not something that will be changeable and something that will die. I mean, eventually ground changes, but you have this idea of him as being like very solid and like supporting her and her foundation. The idea of a cliff too, of course, has to do with the idea of danger. It has to do with the idea of things ending. It has to do with the idea of violence and being split. But if you compare the two, the idea of Heathcliff as being like this like rocky permanent substance versus this kind of tree figure. And it's also important to note, I really like this part very much. I think Emily Brontë, I mean, she is such a genius. Like, there's so much about this novel, the structure, the characterization, the way that she is using this narrative voice and the framing device. Like, it is an absolute feat. It's just one that I don't really, love. But I do love the idea of using Heathcliff here. Heathcliff, importantly, is the name of a child who had died, but we have this very strong name that is given to this person. Importantly, he does not take on the last name. Heathcliff, that's what ends up on his gravestone. Heathcliff is like his only name. It's both his first name and his last name, and much is made of that in the book because he is so different from the people around him, and it has to do with class and it has to do with race. It also obviously has to do with the fact that he is not in line for any kind of inheritance, and a lot of the actions that he takes during the novel, certainly his marriage, have to do with this idea of wanting to gain property, which of course is part of the revenge. But I do want to take a close look at this idea of his ethnicity, and this has to do with the idea of Emerald Fennel and this interpretation, the movie that is coming up. Honestly, as soon as I saw the casting, I was a little bit like, wait, what? What are we doing here? Which we'll discuss that in 1 minute. Because I want to prove for a quick second here that it is indisputable that Heathcliff is meant to be someone who has darker skin. That is like a plot point. So throughout the whole entire book, people call him Gypsy. So this would have had to do with the Romani people. They're an Indo-Aryan people. The first of them can be traced to South Asia. They are people who were treated very badly. In Wikipedia, at one point, they talked about them as a marginalized minority. It was interesting to read that right around 1830 was when that kind of curved top of the wagon, they were people who were forced to be nomadic because they were so excluded. And so they would have sort of their whole community would travel with these wagons. So there are many, many times in the book that he is referred to as a gypsy. Obviously, gypsy is a slur for the Romani people. It is not a great word, which is important to note. It would have been a derogatory term. There are also so many other descriptions of him that have to do with the color of his skin. At one point, he has black eyes and black hair. Someone says that he is as dark, almost as if it came, interestingly, in the beginning, when he first arrives, they keep calling it. So he's not even human in the beginning. So someone says he is as dark, almost as if it came from the devil. At one point, someone says he is the son of the fortune teller that stole my pheasant. Someone at one point calls him dark-skinned. Someone says at one point he's a little Lascar or an American or Spanish castaway. So a Lascar is an East Indian seaman, like someone who was part of the trade, but certainly someone who is coming from India. Nellie Dean at some point says that maybe his father was a Chinese emperor and that his mother might have been an Indian queen. At one point, Heathcliff himself talks about how he wishes he were more pale. So there's just like an enormous amount of evidence supporting the fact that he is someone who is of darker skin. And that is crucial because a lot of the political oomph in this book comes from the fact that he is of lower, social status, and part of that has to do with his ethnicity. A lot is made when people talk of this book about how this is like an impossible love. He has no property. There would have been no reason why Cathy Earnshaw would have married him because she would have been like marrying so beneath herself in terms of class. But it also, within the scope of this novel, the marriage seems impossible simply because of the color of his skin. And again, we need to, I think, resist the temptation to hold Emily Brontë up as like a, someone who was promoting the idea of like needing more social mobility or needing to understand the cruelty in racism. not to mention the idea of feminism, but in many ways she does provide all of that. Like, we have these people who end up, in people's imagination, Cathy and Heathcliff are like this like epitome of love and of passion and of dedication. You know, they're sort of like one soul, and you know, despite their marriages to other people and despite one of them being dead, they're just incredibly dedicated to one another. And very importantly, when Heathcliff leaves for a few years and comes back, he's very wealthy. So you also have this idea, I mean, we also are introducing the idea of money as having power, which was kind of novel because, again, that's the capitalistic kind of middle class, like rising middle class thing here. You know, it used to be that money was not as important as just your land. So there's this kind of new model that is occurring, but it's important that this is occurring to a character who's very capable. We see him as obviously sadistic and cruel, but we also see, but all of that, you know, bound up in that sadism and that cruelty is this idea of him having power. So it is, in some ways, the idea of elevating someone who would have been discriminated, who is discriminated against throughout the novel. Okay, I want to close today by talking a little bit about these casting decisions. We don't know a lot about the Wuthering Heights movie. I'm just kind of dying to see how it is done. Right away, when I saw the trailer of the two of them, actually, I think I saw them in like a Vogue magazine thing, and there was a lot of kind of hyperbolic language about how when they were filming, they were like completely dependent on one another and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my God. But I don't know. I don't even know why I'm skeptical, but I am a little skeptical. The other thing, for some reason, to me, Margot Robbie doesn't look like she's from that era, which is kind of just like a weird take and maybe a hot take, but there's something, I don't know what it is exactly about her. Maybe it's like that I just have Barbie in my mind. She's obviously a very, very talented actor, but for some reason, it's just not the vision that I have of Cathy. And then for some reason, I just like couldn't get behind the chemistry. It's like Jacob Elordi comes from some other kind of era. Like I don't know. I just was like, maybe she's too, I don't know, too modern? For some reason, I was really resisting the casting. Of course, my main reservation had to do with the fact that Elordi is white. And we are in an era, which I love, where the ethnicity of actors does not seem to be like anybody's, like no one is worrying about this anymore. We have people of all colors playing all of these different characters. So I was like, the part about ethnicity and the part about race is one of the crucial elements of this book. So why on earth, like in this era, when we have a lot of latitude in terms of who we are casting, why on earth would you like cast this guy who is like this kind of very like white looking dude? I did a little research, and honestly, it just totally cracked me up. So when Emerald Fennel, to be clear, I didn't see Promising Young Woman because the premise of it just seemed not great to me. Like that was just something I didn't want to absorb. I loved Saltburn, although that was kind of an interesting and kind of controversial thing because at first you think it's going to be this like, you know, really like progressive eat the rich kind of thing. And then it totally doesn't end up being that. It ends up being this like kind of weird like movie about kind of striving and about like wanting to have more material goods, which is not what you expected it to be. So Emerald Fennel is clearly someone who's kind of fearless and is not afraid to take on, you know, very bold ideas and really like put her own mark on them. And so what she said about the casting of Elordi is that he looked exactly like the image on the cover of the book of Wuthering Heights that she had when she was 14. And again, I was like, who did that? Like maybe that was someone who never read the book because I just slapped a Byronic hero on the front of that thing and just like didn't pay any attention to what's actually in the book. But I have to say, I have a very hard time. I'm like I don't think it's great that Emerald Fennel has made this decision. She did say something so funny, though, about the casting of Cathy. This was just killing me. If you're on YouTube, this always looks so weird when people are reading things on the screen, so apologies for like my eyes moving back and forth, but I'm just going to read this little chunk here on my screen. So this is Emerald Fennel talking about Margot Robbie, you know, obviously under the auspices of like why she cast her. Fennel said she is, quote, not like anyone I've ever met, ever. And I think that's what I felt like with Cathy, adding that she is so beautiful and interesting and surprising, and she is the type of person who, like Cathy, could get away with anything. So she's saying that about Robbie, that she's someone who could get away with anything. And then there's a space break, and then this. I think, honestly, she could commit a killing spree and nobody would mind. And that is who Cathy is to me, which I was like, oh my God, I mean, Margot Robbie, please do not commit a killing spree. I do actually think that people would mind that. But this tells you about kind of the boldness of Emerald Fennel. She goes on, Kathy is somebody who just pushes to see how far she can go, Fennel continued, so it needed somebody like Margot, who's a star, not just an incredible actress, which she is, but somebody who has power, an otherworldly power, a godlike power that means people lose their minds. So, I mean, honestly, I have to hand it to Fennel here, because she is really seeing a lot of power in both Kathy and Margot Robbie. And I mean, maybe it's going to be like an amazing feminist take. I'm not really sure. I don't know how it's going to go. I'm dying to see this movie. I think it's also very apt that it is coming out on Valentine's Day, February 14th. I'm recording this on the 4th of February, so it is with bated breath that I am awaiting the debut of the movie. So I'm just going to leave it there. I mean, the idea that Emerald Fennel thinks that Kathy has godlike power, that is just an excellent way to finish this up. This is a book, you know, it's, again, blasphemy, but I will say it. It's not a book that I love, but it is so strange and so weird, and it actually is such an interesting instantiation of both the Gothic novel and the Romantic novel that I really loved, like, kind of what it is. But it's also a book that I find, like, you know, not only kind of problematic in some ways, but also just, like, kind of boring. I mean, here I am at the end, like, that's maybe people are like, what? But I find it kind of boring. That honestly is a terrible note to end on, but that's where we're gonna end. It's just that's gonna be it. So I want to thank you for tuning in, and I hope that, you know, if you are a lover of Wuthering Heights, don't let my boredom, you know, taint your vision of it. But I like to think that, you know, even though I'm not a super fan of this book, I do appreciate it, and I'm hoping that what you've learned today maybe helps you to appreciate it a bit more. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.